He had just buried his wife when the phone rang, and instead of comfort, his son's voice came sharp and cold, demanding he sell the house they had built together. No condolences, no pause for grief, only numbers, buyers, and profit. The kitchen, still heavy with her absence, became a courtroom where he was suddenly the accused, his years of sacrifice reduced to a line item in someone else's spreadsheet. Rage and disbelief twisted in his chest, but he said nothing yet. What came next would change everything. Stay to the end, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Daniel didn't waste time pretending. His words cut through the line with the efficiency of a blade sharpened for years. "Dad, this house is too big for you. The upkeep, the taxes, the repairs. You can't handle it anymore. It's not realistic." He spoke as if he were reading from a script, a tidy set of talking points rehearsed at someone else's kitchen table. Every syllable dripped with practicality, but there was no warmth, no trace of compassion. His father sat in the kitchen chair, the chipped mug cooling in his hand, staring at the steam curling into the air like the last breath of something sacred. He thought of all the winters he had shoveled that driveway, all the summers spent on a ladder patching the roof tile by tile. Every board, every nail carried his sweat, his wife's laughter. And now, to his son, it was nothing but a burden on a ledger. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. He wanted to believe he misheard, that grief had twisted Daniel's tone into something colder than it was. But then came the laugh, short, sharp, dismissive, the same sound Daniel had inherited from him years ago, though he had never wielded it like a weapon. It wasn't the laugh of a son who cared. It was the laugh of a man who had already done the math, who had penciled his father into the margin as an obstacle. The weight of that realization pressed on his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't just mourning his wife. He was mourning the illusion that his son still saw him as more than a liability. He stood and walked to the window, the lemon tree casting faint shadows across the stone path his wife had loved. The garden was alive with the memory of her hands. He had never been a natural gardener, but she had been. She had coaxed rosemary from stubborn soil, pruned vines with patience, whispered life into the earth. Now every leaf, every stone, every bloom felt like an accusation. How quickly love's legacy could be reduced to property value in someone else's eyes. He gripped the counter and asked quietly, "You're worried about me, is that it?" But Daniel's answer was clipped, efficient, and merciless. "I'm worried about what's practical." Practical. The word landed like gravel in his throat. To his son, practicality meant erasing decades of memory, boxing them up, selling them off, and lowering him into a basement with a kitchenette and a windowless wall. Practicality meant stripping him of dignity while calling it love. He felt his pulse in his fingertips, his jaw tight with a bitterness he refused to let slip into his voice. If he spoke too quickly, the rage might break free, and he wasn't ready to show his son that power. Not yet. Daniel continued, weaving in mentions of tuition payments, Melissa's needs, the family's future. Each line was carefully constructed to sound noble, as if robbing him of his home was a sacrifice for the greater good. But beneath every syllable, he heard the hunger, the eagerness to unlock equity that was never theirs to claim. His son was no longer speaking to him as a father. He was speaking at him as a ledger entry, a line that needed to be cleared. The father felt his throat tighten, not from age, not from weakness, but from something more piercing: betrayal. This was the boy he had carried on his shoulders through county fairs, the boy who had ridden in the passenger seat while he taught him how to calculate change for the ice cream truck. He had handed him tools, taught him to measure, to repair, to build. And now that same boy, grown into a man, dared to measure him as excess, repair him with relocation, rebuild him into a manageable problem. He realized then that grief had disguised itself as silence. He had thought he was quiet because he was mourning. But the truth was uglier. He had been quiet because he had not yet faced the betrayal blooming in his own family. His wife had warned him in subtle ways, in the way she stiffened when Daniel asked about money, in the way she deflected conversations about inheritance. He had chalked it up to her darker moods. Now he saw the truth laid bare in his son's voice. He let Daniel's words wash over him, not interrupting, not arguing, just listening the way a soldier listens to the enemy's marching drums before battle. When the speech wound down, when Daniel's voice lost its rhythm and leaned into impatience, he ended the call with a simple, flat reply. "I'll think about it." His son began to protest, but he pressed the button and let the silence return. The kitchen felt different now. It was no longer just the stillness of a house in mourning. It was the pause before a storm. He rinsed the untouched coffee down the drain, the scent of rosemary still clinging to his hands. The bitterness lingered, not from the drink, but from the realization that his own blood saw him as dispensable. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and in the quiet, he heard his wife's voice, soft but steady, reminding him that love is measured not by convenience, but by what you are willing to protect. He turned from the window and looked at the photographs on the wall. Daniel's graduation portrait, Melissa's forced smile at Christmas, little Sophie's crayon drawing of the garden. They stared back at him like exhibits in a trial he hadn't realized he was on. Each image reminded him of what he had given, what he had sacrificed, what he had built, and now he saw what they were willing to strip away. The bitterness in his chest did not fade, but it began to change shape. It was no longer only pain. It was resolve, hard and sharp, settling into place like the edge of a chisel against stone. He knew then that this was no accident. His son and Melissa had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. They had already spoken to buyers. They had already envisioned him moved out, erased from the house he had paid for, stripped of the dignity he had earned. But they had miscalculated. They had mistaken his grief for weakness, his silence for surrender. They had forgotten who he was. He wasn't a man waiting to be managed. He was a man waiting for the right moment to strike. He pressed his palm flat against the counter, steadying himself, letting the cool surface ground him. The garden outside shimmered under the pale light, and in the shadows of the lemon tree he felt his resolve harden. His son thought he was cornered. His son thought the house was already sold in spirit, if not in deed. But the father knew something Daniel didn't. There were secrets hidden in this house, left behind by a woman far sharper than either of them. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of rosemary and dust. And when he exhaled, it wasn't grief that left him. It was the first breath of strategy. The betrayal cut deep. But beneath the wound, there was fire, the kind that doesn't burn out easily. He would not be erased. Not by his son, not by Melissa, not by anyone who mistook his silence for surrender. And as he stood there in the kitchen, with the phone still warm from the call and the house heavy with memory, he allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. Daniel thought he had delivered a final blow. He had no idea it was only the opening move. What waited for them next would be something they could neither predict nor control. The phone rang again before he had even gathered himself from the first call. He thought about letting it buzz into silence, but something told him to answer. Melissa's voice spilled through the line, sweet as honey poured over rusted nails. "Dad, I just wanted to check in," she began, her tone pitched a little too high, every syllable coated with the kind of false warmth that always came before a request. He stood by the window, the garden blurred in his vision, listening as she circled her way toward the truth. Daniel and I have been talking, and we both agree. It would be better if you sold the house. It's just too much for you now. You'd be safer, more comfortable, and honestly, it makes the most sense for everyone. He said nothing at first. He wanted to hear how far she would take it, how carefully she would wrap the knife before pressing it against his chest. Melissa didn't disappoint. "We've got space ready for you," she continued brightly. "The basement's finished. Full bath, plenty of room. Daniel says we can add a little kitchenette so you'll have your own space. It's perfect, really. You wouldn't have to worry about stairs, repairs, taxes, or being alone." Perfect. The word stung. He pictured himself shoved below ground, tucked away like a piece of furniture too heavy to throw out, but too awkward to display. A man who had carried his family through decades, reduced to a tenant in his son's basement. He gripped the phone tighter, feeling his jaw tighten with a slow, bitter fire. He wondered if Melissa practiced this speech in front of a mirror, smoothing the cruelty out of her face until only kindness remained. To anyone else, it might sound like care. To him, it was humiliation dressed in lace. He let her keep talking, each sentence building the cage she thought he would willingly step into. She spoke of Emily's tuition, the family's future, how much they could all save if he did the sensible thing. Each word pressed harder on the wound his son had already opened. He could almost see them together at their dining table, laptop open, a spreadsheet glowing with numbers and columns labeled Dad's House, Proceeds, New Condo. He had taught Daniel arithmetic at that same table when the boy was 8, his small hands fumbling with coins and bills. Now those same hands were busy calculating his father's life into disposable parts. "Melissa," he interrupted at last, his voice low, controlled, and sharper than she expected. "When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not about money, not about logistics, just to ask how I was." The silence on the other end was brittle. She laughed weakly, tried to regain her footing, but he didn't let her. "2 months," he said flatly. "It's been 2 months since you asked me anything that didn't come with a price tag." Her voice wavered for the first time. "That's not fair. We've been busy. You know how life is. Work, school for Emily." He cut her off again, calm but unrelenting. "Busy doesn't erase love. Busy doesn't make you forget who helped raise your family. Busy doesn't excuse turning me into a line item on your budget." He heard her exhale, a soft rush of air that betrayed her mask. "You've been sending Emily money every month, haven't you?" she snapped suddenly, as though the generosity itself was an offense. "Yes," he said simply. $500, every month for 2 years. Another pause. Then softer, almost ashamed. "She doesn't need to know that." And there it was, the real fear. Not that he couldn't manage, not that the house was too large, but that the truth of his quiet strength might unravel the lies they had been weaving about him. To Emily, he wasn't a frail old man in need of management. He was her grandfather, steady, giving, dependable. If she knew the full measure of his support, she might start questioning the stories her parents had been telling. Melissa's silence was confirmation enough. He ended the call before she could recover, his thumb pressing down with a finality that felt like slamming a door in her face. The house around him was still again, but the stillness was no longer hollow. It thrummed with something darker, something steadier. The humiliation burned in his chest, not as weakness, but as fuel. He could almost see their plan unfolding, a sale arranged behind his back, his belongings boxed up, his life shrunk down to the basement of a house that wasn't his. They had already decided on the ending. What they hadn't counted on was that he had his own script. He stood in the hallway, the afternoon light cutting across the dust on the console table, where his wife's glasses still rested. He reached for them, then stopped. He wasn't ready to touch what she left behind. Not yet. Instead, his feet carried him toward her study, the room that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and the perfume she wore when she wanted to feel strong. He sat in her chair, the leather worn smooth by her elbows, and let the silence of the room remind him of who he was. He was not a man to be managed. He was not a burden. He was the keeper of something they didn't yet know existed, and when the time came, he would show them exactly what it meant to underestimate him. For now, he let the rage cool into something sharper than fire. Strategy. Melissa thought she had cornered him with sweetness. Daniel thought he had crushed him with practicality. They believed they were building a cage around him, but he knew something they didn't. Somewhere in this house lay the key that would turn the cage into their trap, and he had no intention of warning them before he closed it. He stepped out into the garden as the last of Melissa's voice faded from his ears, the silence settling like ash after a fire. The air was cool, the kind of late afternoon chill that made every breath sharp, and the garden waited for him the way it always had. But it didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like hers, as if every leaf and stone still carried her touch. The rosemary leaned heavy across the path where she used to bend and snip sprigs for Sunday roasts. He could almost see her there, hands dirt-streaked, smiling as she pressed the herbs into his palm, as though they were trophies. "Fresh from the source," she would say, teasing him for standing idle while she worked. He looked at the empty space now and felt the weight of it press against his chest, a hollow reminder that some absences are louder than words. The lemon tree swayed faintly in the breeze, its branches overgrown, crying out for the pruning she would have insisted on months ago. She hated disorder. She had a way of looking at something overgrown and coaxing it back into balance, patient, deliberate, steady. He remembered her laughter echoing off these very stones, soft and low, the kind of sound that made the house feel alive. Now the same sound had been stolen by the wind, leaving only the creak of branches and the groan of the old wooden fence. Every corner of the yard spoke to him, not in whispers, but in sharp bursts of memory that cut deeper than Daniel's cold words or Melissa's hollow promises. He sat on the worn stone step and let his eyes drift across the lines of the garden. The walls were still standing, rough and weathered, each stone set in place by his hands, while she guided him, telling him which side looked truer, straighter. 25 years of work and laughter lived in these walls. To his son, they were meaningless rocks. To Melissa, they were just high-maintenance landscaping. But to him, they were a monument, not just to marriage, but to survival. Together, they had raised children, buried parents, fought through lean years, and somehow made it all seem lighter by sitting right here at the end of a long day, a bottle of wine between them, watching fireflies spark above the rosemary. He reached for the wooden trellis where vines once climbed in obedient patterns under her watch. Now the vines were knotted, dry and tangled, a reflection of the silence she left behind. He traced the wood with his fingers, feeling splinters press into his skin, and it startled him how easily he could imagine her there, humming softly as she worked. He could almost hear the melody she always fell back on, an old song from the 60s she never quite remembered the words to, but sang anyway. The garden seemed to breathe it back to him, faint and haunting. Inside the kitchen, the air was heavy with the faint trace of her perfume still clinging to the curtains. He turned from the window, and his eyes fell on the reading glasses she had left folded neatly on the console table. The sight of them hit him harder than Daniel's call or Melissa's pitch. Those glasses were waiting, as if she might walk back into the room at any moment, pick them up, and laugh at him for letting them sit there gathering dust. His throat tightened as he reached out, then stopped short. Touching them felt like admitting she was gone. He let his hand fall back to his side, staring at the glasses until the edges blurred with the sting of unshed tears. He walked into her study, the room she had claimed as her own sanctuary. The smell of lemon oil clung to the desk, mixing with the faint floral note of her perfume. The pen she had last used lay across a yellow legal pad, her handwriting etched in tidy lines, unfinished lists and reminders of tasks she would never return to. He lowered himself into her chair, the leather worn smooth from years of her presence. For the first time in days, his shoulders eased as if the chair itself carried a piece of her steadiness. He let his hand rest on the surface of the desk, and it was like holding her hand in the dark, the memory of her skin pressing against his palm, though nothing was there. He closed his eyes, and the memories unfurled with cruel clarity. The nights they sat on the porch drinking coffee, while neighbors' lights blinked out one by one. The morning she stood barefoot in the kitchen, hair tangled, insisting on making pancakes even when she was exhausted. The quiet arguments, the laughter that followed, the silence that always felt safe, because it was shared. Every object in the room seemed to hum with her presence, a chorus of reminders that she had been the one to stitch this life together. Without her, the seams were unraveling, thread by thread, and his children were eager to tug harder. His chest ached with the weight of it, not just grief, but betrayal. She had been the shield between him and their ambitions, the one who saw through the rehearsed voices, the calculations behind their polite questions. Without her, he was the target. But sitting in her chair, surrounded by her scent, he felt her presence shift from memory into something sharper. She had known this might happen. He could feel it in the way her handwriting waited on the pad, in the way her glasses were placed as if they still had work to do. She had prepared for more than just her absence. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk, stiff from years of sticking, and his fingers brushed against a pale blue folder hidden beneath layers of forgotten paperwork. It was heavier than it looked, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. He lifted it out and set it on the desk, his palm pressed against the cover. A yellow sticky note clung to the front in her deliberate block letters. "If you're reading this, you need to know what's inside." His breath caught in his throat, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt something stir beneath the grief. Not hope, not yet, but direction. The garden outside shifted with the breeze, rosemary brushing against stone, the lemon tree casting broken shadows across the study walls. He stared at the folder as though it were a map, a way out of the humiliation his son and daughter-in-law had tried to chain him to. The house was no longer just a vessel of memory. It had become a vault, and she had left him the key. What he would find inside that folder would not only answer the questions she never spoke aloud, but would ignite a truth that Daniel and Melissa could never predict. And as he prepared to open it, the weight of grief in his chest began to transform into something else entirely. Something that felt like power. The pale blue folder sat in front of him like a relic, its edges worn, but its weight undeniable. His wife's handwriting on the yellow sticky note stared back at him. "If you're reading this, you need to know what's inside." His pulse quickened. For a moment, he hesitated, fingers tracing the paper's edge as if opening it might change everything he thought he knew about her, about them, about the life they had built together. Then, with a breath that felt heavier than stone, he lifted the cover. The first thing he saw was a sheath of bank statements, accounts he had never heard of, not the joint accounts they had shared for decades, not the savings they'd spoken of late at night when planning for retirement. These were separate, scattered across credit unions and online banks he'd never known she touched. Modest sums, $8,000 here, $12,000 there. but the sheer number of them startled him. Each account was like a secret carefully planted, waiting to bloom only when she was gone. He sat back, the room closing in, his throat dry as dust. Why hadn't she told him? He turned the page, and the world shifted. A property deed, printed in crisp black letters, stared up at him. The Algarve region of Portugal. Purchased 10 years ago. Owner. Her name alone. His hands trembled as he held the document, scanning each line, each seal, each date. His breath caught as if the air itself had turned heavy. A house, a villa, across an ocean. An entire life he had never been told about. For a long moment, he just stared. The idea of his wife moving through airports, signing contracts, making decisions this large without ever mentioning them, cut deep. But then the shock twisted into something else, something he hadn't felt since before her funeral. A flicker of hope. If she had done this, if she had left this, then it wasn't betrayal. It was strategy. A plan she had built not against him, but for him. His eyes fell on a letter clipped to the deed, written by a Lisbon law firm just last year. The firm confirmed the villa's value and offered to manage it as a rental. In her handwriting at the bottom were 3 small words. Not yet. Keep private. He read them over and over, his lips moving without sound. Not yet. She had been waiting. She had known the timing mattered, that someday soon he would need this escape, this secret, this weapon. He turned another page. Insurance policies. Some old, some newer. Names of beneficiaries printed neatly. He expected Daniel and Melissa. Instead, one of the most recent policies listed only Emily, his granddaughter. His chest tightened. She had cut through the noise of entitlement and chosen the one person untouched by greed. She had seen what he now saw. The younger generation still had a chance to learn integrity, if only someone taught her. He leaned back in her chair, the leather cool against his shoulders, the folder heavy on the desk in front of him. His mind raced, replaying her voice in his head. She had always been deliberate. She didn't forget. If she had hidden this, it wasn't oversight. It was intent. She had been watching the same things he had ignored, the hunger in their son's questions, the way Melissa's eyes lingered on every corner of the house, the constant mention of practicality. She had seen their ambitions long before he admitted them, and she had chosen not to fight them openly. Instead, she had built a fortress in silence. At the back of the folder was a smaller envelope. He opened it with hands that no longer shook from grief, but from anticipation. Inside, a letter in her looping cursive. If you found this, I am gone, and if I am right, the calls have already started. They will circle you, not because they need you, but because they want what you've built. You've always given them the benefit of the doubt. I stopped doing that long ago. The house is yours. It stays yours. But I knew they would try to make you believe you couldn't manage alone. That's why there is a second plan. The villa in Portugal is for you, though not on paper. You will find instructions in the back. Sometimes the only way to win is not to play their game. He read the words again and again, her voice filling the room. Calm, certain, protective. His eyes dropped to the final pocket of the folder where a typed page listed contacts for the Lisbon law firm, a caretaker named Anna, and a key taped to the paper. Next to it, in her handwriting, Trust Anna. She owes me her life. Long story. He pressed the key into his palm, the sharp ridges biting into his skin, reminding him this wasn't a dream. This was real. She had left him more than memories. She had left him leverage. He set the letter down, closed his eyes, and felt the rage from earlier shift into something steadier, more dangerous. They thought he was an old man ripe for manipulation. They thought grief had softened him, They had no idea he was now armed with a truth so large it could burn their plans to ash. The house around him seemed to change shape. The silence no longer pressed down with loneliness. It hummed with purpose. Every photo on the walls, every piece of furniture, every stone in the garden was no longer just a memory. It was evidence, proof that she had trusted him enough to carry the torch she had hidden in the shadows. His son and Melissa wanted him erased, folded neatly into their version of practicality. But she had left him a map out of their grip, and he intended to follow it. He stood, folder in hand, and walked back into the kitchen. The air felt lighter now, though his heart pounded with the weight of revelation. He poured a glass of water, watching sunlight scatter across the counter, and thought of the Algarve coastline. White walls, blue shutters, lemons in a bowl. A life that belonged to him because she had made sure it would. Daniel's voice, Melissa's sweetness, their basement promises. All of it seemed laughable now. They thought they had cornered him with pressure and guilt. They thought they were the ones playing the long game. But the truth was here, in his hands, wrapped in her careful handwriting and sealed with her unshakable faith. And as he locked the folder away, his lips curved into something that wasn't grief, wasn't bitterness, but resolve. He had been stumbling in the dark, but now he carried a light. She had left burning just for him. The fight wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. What lay ahead would test them all. But he knew one thing for certain. The board had shifted, and he was no longer the piece they were moving. He was the player. The letter trembled in his hands, the familiar loops of her cursive pressing into his chest harder than any of Daniel's words ever could. She had written it deliberately, her voice flowing through the ink, as if she had known he would one day need it more than breath itself. If you're reading this, it means they've already started closing in. His throat tightened. She had seen it all coming. The rehearsed calls, the sweetened voices, the false concern. While he had drowned in denial, clinging to the hope that blood still meant loyalty. She had been quietly building walls around him, leaving him weapons disguised as paper. The next line burned into him with equal parts pain and comfort. I've prepared everything so you can protect yourself, and so you can leave if you must. He sat back in her chair, the letter trembling as though it carried a pulse of its own. She had not abandoned him. She had armed him. Every secret account, every deed, every note of instruction was not concealment, but strategy. She had known her absence would make him vulnerable, and she had refused to let him face it unarmed. He closed his eyes and could see her sitting at this very desk, pen in hand, shoulders squared, lips pressed together in that determined line she wore whenever she refused to yield. He had mistaken her secrecy for distance at times, wondering why she lingered over papers he never asked about. Now he understood. She had been drawing a map through the storm, one she would never walk herself, but one she trusted him to follow. His hand moved across the page, tracing her words as if touching her face. Gratitude swelled in his chest, sharp and overwhelming. She had loved him beyond her life, loved him enough to plan for the day he would be betrayed by the very child they raised. The tears came quietly, not the raw sobs of grief, but the steady stream of a man who felt the full weight of devotion pressed into every line of ink. For the first time since her funeral, he wasn't drowning in loss. He was rising, carried by the certainty that she had trusted him to carry this burden. The letter grew sharper as it continued. Do not let them convince you that you are weak. Do not let them take from you what we built. If you must disappear, do it without warning. There is a key. There are names you can trust. Use them. Protect what is yours. She had written it not as a plea, but as a command. her confidence in him etched into every syllable. He sat taller in the chair, the weight of humiliation from Daniel and Melissa melting into something steadier, colder, more precise. He read the lines again and again, each time hearing her voice stronger, clearer, until the room no longer felt empty. She was here, woven into the air, the garden outside, the house they had built stone by stone. He let the gratitude settle in his chest, heavier than grief, but steadier than rage. They had thought him alone. They had thought him vulnerable. But he was not alone. She had refused to let that happen. Even in death, she was his ally, his shield, his co-conspirator. He folded the letter carefully, as though folding her hands into his own, and slipped it back into the envelope. The key taped to the page of instructions gleamed in the fading light, small and unassuming, yet heavier than gold. He pressed it into his palm, the metal biting into his skin, and felt resolve harden around him like armor. They wanted him compliant, diminished, easy to manage. What they would face instead was a man bound not by grief, but by the enduring faith of a woman who had refused to let their legacy be devoured. He rose from the chair and walked back into the kitchen. The house looked different now, as if her letter had changed the air itself. No longer suffocating, no longer haunted, but alive with hidden purpose. The lemon tree outside swayed gently, and he remembered her note about trusting Anna, the woman who owed her life. He wondered what story lived behind those words, what quiet act of salvation his wife had never spoken of. Another secret folded into her careful design. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound no longer empty, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He poured a glass of water and drank slowly, his reflection in the window no longer that of a man beaten down, but of someone sharpening himself for battle. She had handed him the tools. All that remained was to decide how to use them. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt light, as if he could breathe fully again. He whispered into the silence, "I hear you." Gratitude swelled until it steadied into conviction. They had underestimated him. They had mistaken his silence for surrender, his grief for weakness. But now he carried her will in his pocket, her words etched into his heart like scripture. The folder sat waiting on the desk, the letter tucked inside, the key gleaming under the lamplight. He reached out and closed it with steady hands. Tomorrow, Daniel and Melissa would come again with their sweet words and practical speeches, certain they had already won. They would see only an old man too weary to fight. But what they would face was something they could never predict. What she had left behind was not just protection, it was a blueprint for survival. And he intended to build it to the very last nail. The knock came just after sunset, sharp and insistent, the kind of knock that belonged more to a creditor than a child. He opened the door to find Daniel standing tall, his jaw set with determination, Melissa just behind him with that same polished smile she used when she wanted to hide a blade in her hand. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. Daniel stepped into the hallway as if he owned it, his eyes darting over the pictures on the wall, the furniture, the very bones of the house. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, his voice clipped, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Melissa slipped inside without asking, her perfume flooding the air like a warning. They moved as a pair, rehearsed and seamless. Daniel began the speech where he had left off on the phone, all numbers and practicality, while Melissa softened the edges with her counterfeit sweetness. "It's not about taking anything from you," she said, perching on the arm of the sofa like it was hers. "It's about making sure you're not overwhelmed. We've already spoken to a realtor. The market is strong. You'd walk away with more money than you'll ever need." He stood in the center of the room, letting their words circle him like vultures. This time, though, he wasn't shaken. This time, he carried his wife's letter in his mind, her voice reminding him that silence didn't have to mean surrender. He let Daniel's voice rise, let Melissa lean in with practiced empathy. And when the moment peaked, he cut through it with a single line, delivered steady and calm. The mortgage was paid off years ago. The silence that followed was like glass shattering. Daniel blinked, thrown off script. Melissa's smile faltered for the first time, the curve of her lips stiffening into something brittle. He watched the realization flicker across their faces, the calculations scrambling in their minds. All their arguments about expense, about upkeep, about how much strain he must be under, worthless in a single sentence. Daniel recovered first, though his tone carried a sharp edge now. That doesn't change the fact that it's too much for you, Dad. Taxes alone are manageable, he interrupted, his voice firm. Your mother and I made sure of it. This house isn't a weight. It's mine, and it's not going anywhere. Melissa tried to smooth the tension, but her voice lacked the practiced confidence she'd carried before. We just want what's best for you. Think about your health, about safety. You'd be more comfortable. He turned his eyes on her, sharp and unflinching. Comfort doesn't come from a basement, Melissa. Comfort comes from knowing where you stand. And I know exactly where I stand. The room seemed to tilt in his favor then, the air shifting. For the first time, he wasn't the one defending himself. They were. He could see it in the way Daniel shifted his weight, the way Melissa smoothed her skirt to cover the tension in her hands. They had expected compliance, maybe even gratitude. What they found instead was a man rooted in stone, unmovable, unshaken. He stepped closer to his son, his voice low but steady, the kind of tone that carried more power than any shout. I built this house with your mother. Every wall, every stone in that garden has our hands in it. Don't mistake my grief for weakness. I see you. I hear you, and I will not be moved. Daniel's jaw tightened, a flicker of something, anger, frustration, maybe even fear, passing through his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Melissa touched his arm, her smile plastered back on, though it didn't reach her eyes. We'll give you time, she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges. We just want you to think about it. He let the silence hang before answering. I already have. They left a few minutes later, their footsteps sharp against the walkway, their silhouettes swallowed by the night. He closed the door behind them, the echo of the latch sealing more than just wood and steel. It sealed his stance, his resolve, his refusal to be erased. In the quiet that followed, he felt the shift within himself. The humiliation was gone, replaced by clarity. The rage had cooled into focus. He had faced them and stood firm, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt not like a man being circled, but like a man preparing the battlefield. They thought they had seen the full extent of him. They were wrong. He walked back into the study, the folder still resting on the desk, the letter folded neatly inside. He placed his hand on it, steady and deliberate, as if touching her hand again. Her voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that they would try to close in, that they would circle like wolves. She had given him more than memories. She had given him the tools to hold his ground, and when the time was right, to strike back. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of mourning. It was the quiet of preparation. He sat in her chair once more, looking at the key taped to the page, the names written in her hand, the instructions that waited like a fuse unlit. Daniel and Melissa thought tonight had been about pushing him closer to surrender. What they didn't realize was that it had pushed him closer to something else entirely. The next time they came, they would not find a grieving widower struggling to hold on. They would find a man sharpened by betrayal, armed with secrets they could never imagine, and ready to play a game on his own terms. The next morning the house was quiet, the kind of silence that lingered after confrontation. But it was broken by the light sound of small footsteps on the porch. When he opened the door, Sophie stood there, clutching a folded piece of paper with both hands. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her smile hesitant but hopeful, the way only a child's could be when they weren't sure how their gift would land. She held it out without a word, her eyes wide and waiting. He took the paper gently, unfolding it with care, and the moment the lines revealed themselves, his breath caught. It was the garden. Not exact, not measured the way an adult might capture it, but alive with the same energy her grandmother once poured into every corner of it. The lemon tree leaned tall and proud in her bright crayon strokes. The rosemary stretched green across the path. The stone wall stood steady in the background. She had even drawn a small figure sitting on the steps, his shoulders bent but not broken, his face turned toward the sun. He looked down at Sophie, her eyes shining, searching his face for approval. "You drew this?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. She nodded quickly, her pigtails bouncing. "I wanted you to have it. Mom says the garden's too much work, but I think it's pretty. Grandma used to tell me it was her favorite place." The word struck him like a chord struck clean. Out of the mouths of children comes the unfiltered truth, unpolished, uncalculated. She hadn't drawn this picture for leverage or strategy. She hadn't said those words to manipulate. She simply saw the garden for what it was. A place of beauty, a place of memory, a place worth holding on to. And in that moment, he saw not only her honesty, but the thread of his wife's love running straight through her. He crouched down to her height, the drawing still trembling in his hand. "Your grandma would have loved this," he said, his throat tightening as the words left him. Sophie smiled wider, the kind of smile that could cut through even the thickest grief. "I thought maybe if you put it up, it would make the house feel less lonely," she said. He pulled her into an embrace, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a warmth he hadn't felt in weeks. In her innocence, in her honesty, he felt the echo of his wife's presence stronger than ever. Sophie wasn't calculating. She wasn't angling for a share of anything. She was simply giving, and in that purity he felt something he thought he had lost entirely: trust in the future. When she left a little while later, skipping down the walkway, he returned to the kitchen and pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a seashell his wife had once picked up on a trip to the coast. He stepped back and stared at it, the colors bright against the white metal, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt the heaviness in his chest ease. The picture was crude in its simplicity, but in it he saw everything. His wife's hands in the soil, her laughter echoing off the walls, her belief that beauty could be coaxed from even the most stubborn ground. He saw himself not as the old man Daniel and Melissa were trying to write out of the story, but as someone still rooted, still standing, still worthy. And most of all, he saw Sophie, the bridge between what had been and what could still be. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the morning light touch the real garden outside. It was overgrown, in need of care, but in Sophie's drawing it was eternal, alive, untouchable. He realized then that not everything they had built could be stolen, no matter how hard his son and daughter-in-law tried. Some legacies live in the blood, in the hands of a child with crayons, in the truth that passes unbroken through generations. He sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in his chest, his eyes lingering on the drawing as though it were a shield. He thought of the folder still hidden in the study, the key waiting, the instructions written in his wife's hand. Those were weapons, tools for defense, a plan to outmaneuver betrayal. But Sophie's picture, that was something else entirely. That was proof of what he was fighting for. The house no longer felt empty. It hummed now with purpose, the drawing a reminder that even in the face of greed and manipulation, there were still pieces of truth, of innocence, of love, worth protecting. He let his hand rest on the edge of the counter, steady, firm. They would come back, Daniel and Melissa, with their rehearsed words and their polished smiles. But now he had more than strategy. He had something they couldn't touch, something they would never understand. He turned back to the study, the folder waiting under the lamplight, the letter folded neatly inside. He thought of Sophie's voice, so matter-of-fact, telling him the garden was pretty because Grandma said so. Children don't lie about beauty, he thought. And neither did his wife when she left him those words, those secrets, that plan. Between the innocence of a child and the foresight of a woman who had loved him until her last breath, he no longer felt alone in this fight. As he sat down at the desk once more, the drawing bright in the corner of his vision, he felt steadier than he had in years. His granddaughter had given him more than a picture. She had given him a reminder that the story wasn't over, that the legacy of love and truth still lived on, waiting to outshine the shadows of betrayal. And with that warmth anchored in his chest, he turned to the folder, ready for the next move. The drawing stayed on the refrigerator, a quiet sentinel of truth, while he moved with deliberate calm through the rest of the day. He no longer felt the frantic ache of a man trapped by grief and betrayal. Instead, he carried the steel of purpose, sharpened by his wife's foresight and his granddaughter's honesty. When the phone was in his hand again, it wasn't to answer Daniel or Melissa. It was to dial the number of a lawyer he had trusted for years, a man who had seen him through business disputes and contracts, someone who knew him not as a frail father, but as a builder who always finished what he started. The conversation was brief, measured, professional. He didn't waste words, and neither did the attorney. Documents needed reviewing. Titles and deeds needed securing. Safeguards had to be locked in place. Within minutes, wheels began to turn quietly in the background, hidden from the eyes of the son and daughter-in-law who believed they had already cornered him. Every signature, every notarized page, would be a brick laid in a wall they would never climb. But the lawyer was only the first step. The second number he dialed carried an international code, and with it came the weight of oceans. The voice on the other end was warm but firm, belonging to a man who had overseen properties for decades in Portugal. He spoke of the villa as if it were a crown jewel, reminding him of its value, its strength, its place as more than just a house. It was a fortress disguised as inheritance. They discussed logistics, management, transfer protocols. Each word steadied him, turned the key in the lock his wife had left. By the time he hung up, he felt the villa's walls around him, oceans away yet closer than the basement his son had tried to bury him in. In the study, the folder lay open, pages spread like blueprints across the desk. He examined each line, cross-checked every instruction in her handwriting. Nothing she left was accidental. Every account, every property, every contact was positioned like chess pieces, waiting for him to move. And now he did, slowly, methodically, without a trace of hesitation. Days passed, but the house was no longer filled with silence. It thrummed with unseen movement, the quiet buzz of printers spitting out contracts, of pens scratching signatures, of envelopes sealed with decisions that would never be undone. When Daniel called, his phone went unanswered. When Melissa left messages layered in sugar, he deleted them without pause. They had mistaken his silence for defeat before. Now they would learn silence could also mean strategy. At night, he walked the garden. Sophie's picture burned into his mind, the scent of rosemary lifting in the air. He imagined his wife at his side, reminding him to be patient, to be thorough. Patience had always been her gift, while he had been the builder, the one to act. Now he carried both, her foresight and his execution. Every step in the garden felt like a vow, that this house would not be taken, that their legacy would not be reduced to a ledger line, that their love would not be erased by greed. His lawyer sent updates daily, titles secured, trusts established, protective clauses woven into the documents like steel threads in silk. The villa in Portugal was shielded now, unreachable to anyone but him. The accounts, once hidden, were aligned into a structure strong enough to withstand any legal storm Daniel and Melissa might try to summon. It was not just defense. It was a fence disguised as paperwork. He began organizing his own files with meticulous care. He pulled out boxes, sifted through decades of receipts, contracts, tax returns. Each piece that mattered went into the growing wall of evidence, while the rest was discarded into bags he carried himself to the trash. There would be no loose ends, no vulnerabilities. If they came at him with pressure, with lies, with demands, he would have every document ready, every counterstrike sharpened. And yet through the precision, through the quiet grind of preparation, he felt something deeper than determination. He felt calm, the kind of calm that comes only to a man who has already chosen his path and will not stray from it. His wife had given him the outline. Sophie had given him the reminder. And now he gave himself the discipline to see it through. There was no panic, no second guessing, only the slow burn of resolve. On the third evening, he sat at the desk with a glass of bourbon, the lamp throwing long shadows across the walls. He read through the final draft of the trust agreement, every line a declaration that he was not theirs to control. When he signed his name, the ink dark and steady, it felt less like a signature and more like a battle cry. He leaned back, the glass cool in his hand, and stared at the folder one last time. The letter lay within, folded carefully, her handwriting steady even in the face of death. He whispered into the stillness, "It's done." Gratitude swelled in his chest, not just for her planning, but for the strength she had seen in him when he had doubted himself. The night deepened, and in the silence he heard the faint echo of her voice, reminding him what came next. They would return soon. Daniel with his clipped practicality, Melissa with her sugar-laced venom. They would come expecting the same weary man they thought they had cornered. What they would find instead was someone they no longer recognized, a man armored in documents, sharpened by betrayal, anchored by love, and ready to face them without flinching. The phone buzzed on the desk, Daniel's name glowing on the screen. He let it ring, watching the letters fade into silence. He smiled then, small and quiet. The smile of a man who knew something no one else in the room did. The game was already shifting, and they were playing against a board they couldn't even see. He set the glass down, folded the final documents into the folder, and placed it carefully in the drawer. Tomorrow would bring another step, another layer of protection, another move forward. But tonight, he allowed himself the rarest gift of all, peace. Not the hollow peace of surrender, but the iron peace of a man who knows his enemies are already too late. And as he rose from the chair, turning off the lamp and letting the darkness settle, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next time Daniel and Melissa walked through that door, they would not be walking into the home of a man ready to yield. They would be walking into the stronghold of a man prepared to fight, and they would learn what it meant to underestimate him. The morning light fell across the study in thin, golden lines, and for the first time in weeks, he felt no weight pressing on his chest. The folder was closed now, the signatures complete, the instructions followed. What remained was clarity. He moved through the house with steady steps, opening drawers, pulling boxes from the attic, sorting with the precision of a man who knew exactly what mattered and what no longer did. Old clothes that held no meaning were folded neatly into bags. Pieces of furniture his children might try to claim were tagged and sent away. Each item returned to them was not a gift, but a reminder. Take what you think you wanted, but you will never touch what I chose to keep. He held on to the things that were truly his. Her glasses on the table, the photograph of Sophie in the garden, the seashell magnet on the refrigerator holding her crayon drawing. These were not possessions. They were anchors. He wrapped them carefully, placed them in a single trunk, and closed the lid as though sealing a covenant. Everything else could go. He had no need to cling to the excess when he carried the essence. By midday, movers arrived, paid in cash, efficient and silent. They hauled away boxes destined for Daniel and Melissa's doorstep. He didn't watch as they loaded the truck. He didn't need to. The act itself was enough. They would open those boxes expecting leverage, proof of dependency, relics of control. What they would find instead was the weight of their own arrogance, the scraps of a life they never valued, while the true heart of it remained beyond their reach. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, a single suitcase by his side, and spread out the documents from Portugal one last time. The villa waited, untouched, a horizon carved by his wife's foresight. The contact list gleamed under the lamplight. The lawyer in Lisbon, the caretaker named Anna, the number of a bank where accounts stood ready. He imagined the sun over the Algarve, the white walls, the blue shutters, the scent of salt in the air, a place not of exile, but of choice, not a hiding place, but a stronghold. The thought did not feel like running away. It felt like stepping into the life she had built for him, the one she had known he would need when love turned to betrayal under his own roof. He felt her in the decision, steadying his hand, guiding his steps. She had written of escape, but he understood now it wasn't about leaving behind. It was about moving forward, carrying her design into a future that belonged only to him. When night fell, he poured himself a final drink and walked through the house room by room. He touched the walls, the banister, the frames of windows where they had once stood together, watching storms roll across the sky. He whispered his thanks into the silence, not for the memories, but for the strength they had given him. Then he turned out the lights one by one until only the porch light glowed, the same light she had always insisted should never go dark. Sleep came easily that night, not the restless drifting of grief, but the deep rest of a man who had chosen his path. At dawn, he rose, showered, and dressed with the quiet efficiency of someone leaving nothing to chance. He placed the suitcase in the trunk of his car, slid the folder into his briefcase, and locked the door behind him. He didn't look back. The house was theirs to covet, theirs to circle like wolves around a carcass they thought was still warm. But what remained was his, and it was already beyond their grasp. The road stretched ahead, clear and certain. He drove past familiar streets without a flicker of regret. Every mile placed more distance between him and their greed, more distance between him and the basement they had imagined for him. What filled him instead was a stillness, a peace, edged with victory. They would never know until it was too late. They would search for weakness, for leverage, for control, and they would find nothing but echoes. On the flight across the Atlantic, he sat by the window, the clouds rolling beneath him like a promise. He thought of Sophie, her drawing pinned to the refrigerator, her innocence untouched by calculation. He thought of her future, a future he could still protect from afar, shielded by the structures her grandmother had left in place. He thought of his wife, her handwriting still burning in his mind, her faith in him etched into every instruction. For the first time since the funeral, he felt not loss, but presence, not grief, but gratitude. The plane touched down in Lisbon under a sky streaked with fire. The air smelled of salt and stone, alive with the pulse of a new beginning. The caretaker, Anna, met him at the gate. Her eyes warm, her handshake firm, her words carrying the weight of the trust his wife had placed in her. "Welcome home," she said, and though he had never set foot on this soil before, the words fit. When he arrived at the villa, the walls gleamed white against the sun, the sea whispering just beyond. He unlocked the door with the key she had left him, the metal turning smoothly in the lock, as if it had been waiting only for him. Inside, the rooms were quiet, empty, but not hollow. They breathed with possibility. He set his suitcase down, opened the shutters wide, and let the light flood in. He stood there for a long time, the ocean stretching before him, and felt the truth settle in his chest. He had not been reduced, not erased, not broken. He had been tested, and he had endured. The betrayal of his son and daughter-in-law would echo only in their own empty victories, while he stood rooted in the life his wife had prepared for him. He poured a glass of wine that evening, carried it to the balcony, and watched the sun bleed into the sea. Victory had not come with shouts or battles, but with silence, patience, and unshakable resolve. He had given them nothing but the illusion of control, while he carried everything that mattered into the future. And as night fell over the water, he raised his glass to the horizon, to her, to the legacy that refused to die. What lay ahead was his alone, and this time he would live it on his own terms. Life often tests us in ways we never expect. In this story, a father loses his wife and then faces betrayal from the very people he raised. Yet instead of surrendering, he discovers strength in the love she left behind, the innocence of his granddaughter, and the dignity he still carries. The lesson here is simple but profound. You are never powerless, no matter how others may try to diminish you. Preparation, patience, and quiet determination can protect not just your home or your wealth, but your self-respect. For older generations, it's a reminder that age does not erase wisdom or worth. In fact, it often sharpens them. Sometimes the greatest victories are not loud confrontations, but the silent choices that prove you will not be erased. Your legacy is more than property or money. It is the strength you show, the values you pass down, and the quiet resilience that speaks louder than words. Hold firm to what is yours. Honor the love that built your life, and never let anyone convince you that your chapter is over. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and share where you're watching from. Your story matters too.